What's up, guys? In this video, you're going to see a coaching call I had with a student in the program. I was teaching him React. This just gives you a little sneak peek into my program. If you want to join the program or learn more about it, there's a link in my description. You can book a call with me. Even if you don't want to join the program and you just want to learn React, this video is going to be very helpful as well. The only issue is that the Seth, my student who I was teaching, he has some prerequisite knowledge that you may not have, or you may have more prerequisite knowledge than him. But basically what I was teaching him was most helpful to him because my coaching to him was based on the context of what his prerequisite knowledge is. So you may not be in the same spot he is. So, some things are going to be useful for you. Some things may not be. Nonetheless, here's the video. It goes into React, how to learn, basically how to build a to-do app in React and understanding the code behind a to-do app in React. These are essential foundational skills you're going to need to have as a web developer. All right, so let's get into the video.
Okay, so I figured I would just start like this. It says to reverse engineer this here. So this is the to-do
You should
app.
be able to code it from scratch, yeah.
So we got
So I don't know if it helps, but the way I reverse engineer when I was learning React, is I would first play with the code to see what each thing does, but then I would memorize each thing chunk by chunk until I had the whole thing memorized. So you could do almost like
what would you consider a chunk?
the state, for example, setting up the state, and then the delete to do function, the complete to do function. Each of those functions are good chunks to memorize. I would try to from memory just do the delete, the add, the complete, and I would reference the code only if I was stuck. But I would try to, and I'll keep on doing that until I was able to code it from scratch.
Okay, what I'm seeing here is the state here, which is to do items, which would be, I'm assuming where these are stored, correct?
Wait, hold on. So what are we doing? Are you trying to understand like the state and you're asking me questions about it?
I'm trying to without, if you weren't here to help me, how I would try to reverse engineer without any other help, like just based off the context of what we've been doing so far.
Yeah.
So I would see, okay, we import use state from React, create the function. I see here you have the get random ID to generate random numbers, which I don't know what yet for. Then we have the state here, and then we have this one as well. Input value, I'm not sure what this is yet, but this one is called to do items. So I'm assuming that this is where these are going to be stored, correct?
The to do items, the variable to do items, yeah.
So when you add them and stuff, they're going here. All right, this is what's keeping track.
Mhm.
Those. So in here, by default, we have, it looks like it starts here and then it ends here. So it's all this. Now we have these by default, which starts on there. And so we have an array. So we have an array with these in here. And obviously I'm assuming, so if we get rid of these, it'll still work, right? It just won't by default have these, correct?
Yeah.
Would it be okay to simplify it for now? I got rid of the default.
Yeah.
Things.
That's what you want to do when you're you want to modify the code. So yeah, you asked me this question. Does the code in there default go in the app? The way you would test that is you remove it and then run the app. You would just do that with kind of everything. And then you should, since you've done like 6K with you code word problems, you should know to do, oh, maybe you don't know filter yet. Oh yeah, have you learned that?
It's yeah, those are in the course.
Oh, it's in the course. Okay, cool.
The thing is though, I just haven't had a single instance where I've actually felt like I should use it. So I'm not super familiar with it. I know what it does and I have the syntax down, but not 100%. But I could, yeah.
And you don't have to use it. Like you can do other things instead, but it's common convention to use like .map and .filter in React. So you should definitely learn how to use it. It's like best practice.
So this still works, still does everything. I've gotten rid of those. So by default, the state should be an array, basically, at least an array, empty array.
It can be anything. The state can be whatever you declare it as. So you can set it as a Boolean, a string, but for this to-do app, we're going to set it as an array because that's just the data structure that we happen to use to store the to-do items. But technically, we can use any kind of data structure. This is just how it's implemented, though. And so usually we're going to do like a list of items. A list is usually going to be stored in an array.
So because we're putting multiple things in here and it could be added, things can be taken away is why we're using an array, right?
Yeah, and it keeps the order and everything. So yeah, it's a good data structure for the to-do items.
Okay, so now keep going. Next, we have variable delete to do, which I'm guessing is going to be a button for deleting to-dos. And then it's a function with a variable assigned to it. ID is the parameter set to do items, and then to do items dot filter item. So when you filtering takes everything, and if it's true or false is what judges whether it ends up in the new array, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you see like what it's doing?
So with my basic knowledge that I've gained so far of these things, okay, so here I see that there is a filter method being used, this little function, and then outside of it, we have, so this ends here. Then it's all in parentheses for set to do items.
And then sometimes to make it easier to like, sometimes it helps if you want to separate it. Like we could instead create a variable called to do items filtered and set it equal to do items dot filter in that code in there. And then just put to do items filtered, that variable name we created, and just put it in between the parentheses and set to do items. Sometimes it's helpful to separate it like that, if that makes
Yeah.
so that way it's like not all nested and it can be harder to
Mhm.
read. But yeah, it's the same
So
thing
with
either
the way it
way.
is right now, I wouldn't know how to do that. So why is this set to do?
Wait, the way with what? You don't know how to do that?
I wouldn't know how to separate that by myself right now. So
Oh.
why is this filter in parentheses of set to do items?
So first,
Okay,
do you
no,
want to?
say set to do items.
Yeah.
And then, so for the set to do items, then it's filter. Okay. Could you I'm understanding it, but can you explain the logic to that?
Yeah. So
So
do you know what data structure is to do items?
an array? What do you wait?
Yes, it's an array. And then if we do to do items dot filter, do you know what that returns?
I know that filter tells if something is true or and then returns it, or returns a new array made up of the only the things that were true, right?
Exactly. So to do, yeah, so to do items dot filter is going to return an array, which will contain the original items or the original, it will basically be the original array that to do items. It actually returns a copy of the original to do items array, but with the items that were removed from the filter operation. If it returns false, it gets
Yeah.
removed.
What it's looking for to add is false. So this, which is, so if this is not this, this is true. So if item
Yes.
ID is not equal to ID, that means true, which then means, so if the ID is not equal to the ID, then it will be added to the new array.
Yes. So then now we have that new array with that item removed, right? That with the item that equals that ID. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So we have
Yeah.
that new array, and then that new array is being passed into set to do items. So then we're setting the to do items array, which is a state variable, to that new array with that item removed. Maybe it'd be better if I share my screen and we walk through the code so I can play with the code as I show you. Okay, you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can have it to how you had it. We're going to remove that. Okay, now it's removed. Yeah. So I'll explain again. Okay, so when I was saying we can separate the variables, basically what we can do is I can just copy this, take it out, and then say const filter to do items equals, and then I just paste it, and then it's right there. That'll be, so we'll save the output of this filter function into this variable, and then we can just put that back in set to do items, and it'll do the same.
Okay.
Just to verify, I'll submit it and I'll exit. Yes. Okay. So the way this works, so that way we can take this step by step more easily, is okay, first we should see where delete to do is used to see like what the starting point is. So if we see where it's used here on the on click button for this X button. So
you just pull down.
I copied it, press Command F, and I pasted it there, and then I press enter and I found it. So yeah, delete to do is used down here. And so this X button is supposed to delete it, right? That's this button here. And so when I click it, on click, we execute this function, which when we call this function, it'll execute this code. And then this code basically executes the delete function, passing item.id. And it might actually be helpful to first understand how this state variable generates the list. So that way, because that's actually to understand the code, it's better to start with like how everything originates, because delete to do item only happens after we make the list. You know what I mean? So I think I should start with that. But we're real quickly, I'll say it here too, but it'll make more sense if later when I explain how it generates the list. But basically, this X item, yeah, when it's clicked, it executes the delete to do function and passes in item.id. Yeah, that's because, yeah, so item.id, it'll check if it'll filter. So it'll take all the to do items and it'll filter it. So that way only it'll return an array of the to do items with only the items that have an ID that don't equal the ID that was passed in, which is the ID of the to do item we were trying to delete. But let me start with, because that doesn't even make, I'm going to focus on the other stuff first. Okay, so let's start with adding a to do. because that's like the first thing you can do. So when you add a to do, or you know what, actually, let me start with, let's not even start with adding a to do. Let's just start with, let's say it comes with predefined to do items. Basically, if I were to, and where's the log statement? Do you know how to like console.log? Let's see. Yeah, there's a console.log right there. Okay. So if, just to verify, if I console.log to do items, we can see that it's going to be equal to an array of what we defined in here. That makes sense?
Okay. So
Right now I'm logging to do items. And when we use this use state variable, do you know how the use state hook works?
pretty so you import use state. It's not exactly super clear, but it seems like it holds information that changes that's not like just static on the page that changes. So far, it's the only one that I've learned. It seems like it's what you use anytime that anything is going to change based off of interacting with the page.
I would say so. Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. For the most part, yeah. Like when you're
So just
changing
hold.
data within the app, which is,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Only exception I can think of is if you click a link to go to a different page. You don't have to use state to do that. It could be something else. But yeah, for the most part, yeah. Okay. But do you know what it returns though when we call it?
What do you mean what it returns?
If I call this, wait, hold on, what's this error? If I call this hook, this is a function, right? I'm calling the
Mhm.
function. Do you know what that returns? Do you know what I mean by when I say do you know what does it return?
Like, what is the result going to be?
Yeah, because we're setting these variables equal to whatever the return value of invoking this function is, executing the function.
It's an empty array. While this stuff is made into a comment.
So what it returns, it's going to return an array with two variables in it. One is the state variable. This is the state, and the other one is like set state variable. So the state is going to equal what we put in here. Because what you just told me right now, you said the use state function will return the array that we pass into it.
As
But
of right now, I think.
okay, because what's going to happen if I console.log output is going to be this empty array? Because that's what you were saying, right?
Yeah, that's what I would assume.
Okay, so if I console.log, actually, there's some errors though, because let me actually, I'm going to keep these names because they're used down there lower in the code base. So I'm going to keep it there. I'll just create a new state, set state, or if I call this hello Bob. So you're saying, oops, output. So you're saying output might equal hello Bob, the string.
Yeah,
If we console.log it,
you got to fix the output up there. It's not spelled right.
no, thanks. Let me get rid of this one. Okay, so here's the log statement. You see it down there. Here's the output. This is this statement. So if we look at it, it's actually an array where the first variable is hello Bob as a string, and the second variable is a function. The second variable is a function which allows us to change the state, which is the first variable. So right now, so output is actually an array where the first variable is equal to that string that we pass in, and the second variable is a function. Does that make sense? And I'm just taking it step by step. Like I know, like I'm not giving too much context on why I'm asking you it makes sense, but I'm just asking like this simple thing that I'm trying to say, which is that output is equal to an array where the first element in it is a string and the second element is a function. Just want to know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, but so
Okay.
if you added, could you do hello Bob, comma, and then another string, and then it would have two variables and then the function after as a third, or?
No, if I do that, I think we'll set that. It's still just hello Bob because it's only the first argument of the use state hook that sets the state.
Okay.
That's how the use state hook works. You'd have to look at the React documentation. So if we look at it, okay, here's what it returns. Here's what I was asking you earlier. Use state returns an array with exactly two values. The first element is the current state. The second element is the set function that lets you update the state to a different value. That's the most relevant information right now. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think also you should understand this syntax. If I say A, B equals hello, Bob, does that make sense? Do you know what A and B would equal?
Yeah, it's destructuring.
Yeah, by console.log A and B, it says
Mhm.
hello, Bob. Yeah, so that's what's happening here because, yeah, basically the use state hook is returning hello, Bob. And then the second argument is some function that somehow resets the state.
So that other function is just like the automatic. Oh, wait. So output equals hello Bob. So in to do items state. Wait, so what happens when you render when you log the actual use state above that? Would it say it would say to do items and then set to do items? Set to do items would be equivalent to the F, and the to do items would be equivalent to hello Bob.
Yeah, you said set to do items. Yeah, exactly. Because that's what the use state hook always returns. Current
Okay.
state, which during the first render, it will match the initial state that you have passed. The initial state, notice how they make it look, like highlight it, because that's a variable name they're using the definition where initial state is this. So when you call the use state, function, we pass in the initial state. And so initially the first element will equal the current state, which initially is the initial state. Yeah, and it's good to look at this documentation as you're trying to reverse engineer the to-do item or the to-do list app. Okay, so now do you understand more how the useState function works? Okay, so when we initially call useState, I set it as an empty array. Why is it red? State. See what I'm doing wrong here?
I don't know.
To-do items not defined. Okay, never mind. Oh, that's input value. Whoops. I didn't take the wrong one. Sorry. Okay, so to-do items is so yeah. So if we initially set it to that, now if I console.log to-do items, now we should know why it's this array of these two objects, because it's going to be the initial, it's going to log the initial state that we pass in, which happens to be that array. And okay, so now you get that, right? That the to-do items is going to equal the initial state we pass into the useState hook.
Yes.
Okay, so now the way this works is the React app, the code we see here on the right, or not the code, but the HTML that's rendered, that's from what we're returning here, right?
So return div form on submit add to do text value equals input value. Yeah.
And so yeah, this is the input field, this is the submit button, and then below that we have this list, and we can see that. So this list is this variable, and basically this list is the result of doing to-do items.map. So we remember what to-do items is, which is this array of objects. And so what happens here is that we basically go through sorry, what?
I have a question. So where it says
Yeah.
input type equals submit, is that a commonly used thing for buttons that does something different than just saying?
That's just a common thing for like a button on a form. It's so when you do input type submit, that creates a button. This is like I think it's the only scenario that it creates a button from the input. Usually though, when you use input, it's not going to be a button, but there's different input types. Like I could do.
Yeah, because I know about input like type text.
Yeah, there's different types like radio.
Password.
Now it's a radio button. See, checkbox, not the checkbox. But when we do it as a submit, what was it? Submit? Yeah, submit, it becomes a submit button. That's just how they made it. We don't have to do that. We could just do a regular button.
The same thing as just having a button that says submit on it, right?
Yeah. But except the difference is on submit up here in the form, the way HTML form elements work is if it's a form element, whatever you set the on submit attribute to, you're going to set it to a function. Whenever the input that is a child of the form element, whenever that input has a type of submit and it's clicked, then the form element will execute the function that's passed into on submit. That's just like one way to do it in HTML, but we don't have to do that. We could just get rid of that. And I could just say on click, we're going to execute that function. So to test it, still works, but we had to add. And we don't even have to have, oh wait, sorry, it's not even a button. Let me make it a button. I could say submit. Okay, so now it's like the same thing.
That does simplify it a little.
Yeah.
It's not the things I've already learned.
This is simpler.
Click, it does that function. And then with the value of submit is what it says on it. Okay. And then input type text value, input value, and then on change, update value. To me.
Okay, so now we can see that this list object or this list array, it's inside this UL. So I think another thing to know is that in React, when we do arrays, so this is JSX. You know what JSX is?
Yeah, it's like the React version of JavaScript. You're mixing HTML with JavaScript.
Yeah, so it's HTML and a JavaScript file or a React file. I'm gonna open ChatGPT because I thought that if I put an array,
unordered, it should be bullet points, right?
Yeah, for each string, but it's not. So I'm going to ask.
I think it's all one bullet point because it's an array.
Yeah, but I thought list is an array too, because to-do items.map returns a new array. Let's test it. If I console.log list, yeah, see, it's an array where this is each of the elements. I wonder, that's not bullet pointed. I'm silly. I forgot. Because it has to be an li inside an li element within the ul. If I made this ul, yeah. Oh, sorry, list. What is it called? List item. Yeah, this is a list item, and then UL is unordered list. Okay, so now we can see. Okay, so now we can see it's like that. So we can see that in JSX, it like unpacks what's inside the array and puts it inside here, inside the UL element. Does that part make sense?
So
because with JSX, the way it works is, and I'm pretty sure this is how it works. Okay, first of all, you know how the curly brackets work in JSX?
Yeah, the curly brackets are like, I know in specific instances when you do use them, value on another function, when you want to put that in another one, it's
Mm.
like doing the same, the little back tick and then the money sign in
Ah,
the brackets on JavaScript,
yeah, yeah,
something in another place.
yes. It basically allows you to add JavaScript inside JSX. But at the end
Okay.
of the day, JSX is only supposed to render the HTML elements. So whatever JavaScript code you put inside JSX, it should return some kind of JSX.
Okay.
So yeah, within these curly brackets, we have this array. So that's a JavaScript array. But in the way it works is it'll basically unpack that and take everything out of the array like that. So we can just get rid of that. And then it's the exact same thing because that's basically what it does in JSX. It takes the array and it just unpacks it like how I did right here.
Okay.
So that makes sense?
Yes. And but instead what you had around it was okay.
Because this is how I can add an array to the JSX between the curly brackets. And then when the JSX sees this array, it unpacks it like that. Okay, so now we understand how the arrays work and how it unpacks the stuff that's inside it when we put it into JSX. So now if we look at what was originally in there, it was just list, which is an array because to do items.map returns an array. So
And map just does a function on every part of it returns a new array of with all the things in the other array, but now with some kind of function done to them.
yeah, so to do items, it's the initial state, or not, it's not even the initial state anymore. It includes the new stuff we added, and we'll go into how that works. But since we added items, and let me actually just reset it just so it's clear. So it's still like when I reset it, it's still to do items is just this array, those objects in it. So it's that array, and then to do items, let me see, we map it, and then for each item, which is those two objects that were in that to do items array, for each of those objects, we return an li element where, what is the style? Okay, so let's ignore that for now. Let's keep it simple. But basically, it's going to return the element with inside it, it's going to have an input checkbox, which on change, it's going to execute. Let's keep it super simple. Let's start with what we know. We'll add that after. So to start out, we're just going to return an li element, name of that to-do item.
Okay, so first we have the to do items function.
To do
and then
items
with the
function.
with a filter. Okay. Oh, do item. Okay, list equals. Wait, what happened to the filter?
Filter, we stopped. I wanted to, it wasn't that I removed it. I wanted to focus on,
Okay, so now we just have the to do items from the state. Now we're going to do to do items dot map. So on each of those to do items, we're going to perform a certain function, which would be return list item key equals item ID, which would be the random numbers because I guess they have to have some kind of special ID. Then style equals style item.
it's this
Style.
function. You know what? Let's, yeah, but let's just, how about, is it cool if we just focus on this to start?
Yeah.
And then we can get to the other stuff.
Actually, so the way that I learned it relatively quick from the what's it called? From the other tutorial that was written in text by React. The way it was done on React is that it actually did it from the beginning.
Yeah.
That might be the best way rather than having the whole thing and then breaking it down.
You want me to just build a to-do app from scratch right now?
That would probably be the best and easiest and fast way to understand
Okay.
everything.
Okay. So we're going to rerun this app. So now it's just an empty app. There's nothing in it. Return something. And we have that here. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is let's just do what we were looking at. We were displaying a list of to-do items. Perfect. I'm just kidding though, because it's just HTML. But we want to display using the state variable. That, yeah, we're going to start with that. So we're going to start with being able to display this list that I have here, except instead of hard coding it as HTML like this or JSX, we're going to store that data in a state variable, and then we're going to use that state variable to render that JSX. So I'm going to say const, let's just call it state right now. State and then set state equals, and then I got to import it. And then the way I import it here, that's just like a syntax thing. You have to learn that when you import from the React module, React is the default import, which if we were importing from this file, for example, this app is the default import. Now, this is a more specific import. We can import, we're destructuring an object. We can import use state specifically like that. What we can say is we're going to set the state and we're going to set it to hi and world. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that. And now if I use the curly bracket so I can insert JavaScript, I'm going to pass in state. What is state going to equal?
State should be hi.
So I see how it's confusing because this looks like it would map to that. But
Yeah.
would world map to set state?
That's what
world.
I'm thinking.
Remember the use state hook, the way it works is we pass in the initial state, and then the use state hook returns an array with exactly two values, where the first element is the current state, which will match the initial state we have passed. So the initial state I'm passing is this entire,
Okay.
yeah. So what is state going to equal?
Hi and world, that whole array.
Exactly. And then set state is just going to be the function that resets the state variable. So now what I did here is I put the state variable in this JSX. And so if we remember how it works is, so the state variable looks like this right now. And so the way it would work is it like unpacks it, and then it just becomes like these two strings, not the quotation marks. But we want to make it a bulleted list instead, right? So what we can do is we need to wrap we need to put these string values inside an li element, right? So let's just call it a const. Let's just call it list items. So list items, we want it to equal state.map, because we're going to map through each of the strings in this array. And for each string, we want to return the li element with the string in the middle. So we're going to map it. And so for each item, we're just going to return the li element with the item inside. Now this is list items. Paste that in there. Oh, I forgot to add. You're supposed to add a key. So I see these errors down here. You're supposed to add a key prop. We don't really have a key. I'm just going to make the key item as well. Okay. What we do for the state variable is, yeah, for each of those items, basically we turn the input of this map function. Sorry, no. So basically the state variable is this, right? And so maps over that, and then it's going to return
a key with the value, or with that has it's going to return a list item. Okay, a list item that is equal to whatever's in state. Wait, but okay, so it's going to iterate through. So we got list items equals state.map. So the map function is going to iterate through everything in that array.
The map function.
Yeah,
is that what you said? Yeah, it's going to iterate everything through in the state array.
And then so for each thing, like the first would be hi, then it's going to turn hi into a list. Well, it's going to be a list item with a value of item. An item being passed into here is what it's whatever it's iterating on is going to be.
Yeah, so it's either the hi or world. So basically this map function will then return an array that is equal, except
list items.
Now that we have it in JSX.
Array. So now list items holds a new array with all of the things from the state just turned into a list item.
So that's why, because remember how it's unpacked, because it was basically like now, yeah, list items equals that. So that gets unpacked. I just saved it. It's still doing the same thing. And if I unpack it, that's the same thing. I won't do it. Okay. So far, oops. Does all this code make sense? Or do you have any questions about it? Okay. I think you're right. This is better. We can go step by step, and then I make sure that you understand everything that's on here so far, and we can move forward. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So now you can tell me, what feature do you want to add to it now?
I would assume that the next step, now that we have that, would be a place for the user to make the state. So a place for them to type in what is going to go into the state.
So like the input?
Yeah. So it'd be return, I think, and then it would be, you'd put the brackets, like the empty bracket or whatever that's holding everything, and then in that would be just input type text.
Yeah, input. And I think the default is text. So you technically don't have to put it. It's the same thing.
I keep it simple. I just not put the type.
Yeah, it's because it's text by default. But okay, so we have that. That's what you said was next. Now we want it to be so that way when we type something into it, we can press a button that adds that item to the to-do list, right? So the way we can do that is first we need to be able to access the value that we have typed in here. And the most common way to do that in React is we're going to set it in state. So I can say const, we're going to create a new state variable, and we'll call it input. So now that I have two state variables, I'm actually going to make this more descriptive so it's more clear what we're talking about. So this is to-do items, and then we're going to set the to-do items. And so instead of state, we map through the to-do items. Still makes sense, right? So now we're going to create a new state variable. We're going to call it input and set input, and we're going to make it equal. We're going to use the use state, and the initial state would just be an empty string because that's how it should start out. So what we can do is we can add the value prop to the input, and we can set it to input. But if we do that, if I come up here and I try and type, right now I'm typing, nothing's happening actually. And the reason is because,
I'm just looking over the code. So value equals input. Maybe to make it a
component.
little bit easier to read, do you think for the use state on the input and the set input, like for the default value, we can just put type here?
Oh, just put type here instead of input?
No, like instead of an empty string for the use
Oh,
state,
sure. Yeah, yeah.
get caught up in the rest of it and look back at it. I'm like, wait, what was that again? I'll just know, yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, good idea. Okay, so now if I type, it doesn't do anything. If I try and delete it, it doesn't do anything. You hear me typing? The reason is because we set the value of input to be equal to, I'm going to call it input state to differentiate the name, input state, because we set the value to that. And if we try and change the input value by typing stuff into it, the value is hard coded to the input state. So it just stays. So what we need to do is whenever we add text to the input, we need to update the state to include the new character we're typing. And so the input HTML element has an attribute called onChange, which we can set it equal to a function. And so basically, whenever onChange is an event, and an event means there's these events are like it waits for something to happen, and then it can execute some code on that event. So the event that we care about is the change event, and we use the onChange attribute to do something when it changes. And so when it changes, we can do a function. And this is just something you'd have to memorize. But basically on change, I think it'll execute a function and it'll pass in an input as it'll pass an event as the input for the function that it'll execute. And this event object has something called event dot, I think it's value, could be wrong. And so this value is whatever we're typing. And I could be wrong on that. So I'm going to actually double check. So this is where I set it to undefined because e.value is incorrect. It's actually supposed to be e.target.value.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now I fixed it. So we'll
in
do
this
it again.
case, and things, would I not ever really use e.value? I would be using e.target.value.
Yeah, but that's something you can easily look up. You don't necessarily have to memorize that. So if I type now, we can see when I'm typing this console.log input statement, it's logging the strings, right? Every time it updates. You see it?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why we went through that trouble of adding the value in onChange prop. So that way we can have this input state. Now we have access to the value that's in there. So now that we have a variable in JavaScript that holds the value of the input, now we can use that variable to add the to-do item. Because when we add the to-do item, we want to add it and we want that to-do item to have the name of whatever's in that input box, right? So I'm going to create a new function called add to do. And what this function is going to do is it is going to set to do items, and there's syntax that so the way we're going to do it is we're going to go state, and it's going to be, input state. Okay. So actually let's look at the React documentation. Set state. Okay. Use state is a React hook that lets you add a state variable to your component. Usage, adding state, updating state based on previous state. Okay. So the way the set state variable works, which is the second thing that the use state hook returns, is actually I'll just show you. So if I do add to do item like this and I make it equal to input state, we actually want it to be an array because the initial state is an array, and we need it to be an array because we do to do items dot map. We map over an array and we return a list of li elements. So when I add to do, I'm going to just set to do items to an array with the input state inside that array, which is whatever we're typing in here. The problem with this though.
Question. So the constant to do equals and then function, is there any specific reason why you made it a variable that equals a function rather than just its own function?
Not really. That's fine too, except it's like more modern to do it like this. It's better practice. It depends. There's some differences where if you define the function as a property within an object, it affects whether that function has access to this variable, but that's not really important right now. But this is just more like style, to be honest. It just looks like nicer to me. And I think most people go with that too, because it's like, looks a little more clean to me.
Do the same for app function?
I think so, yeah. Const app equals, yeah, it's the same thing. It still works. Refresh it to confirm, because it's the same thing. But I guess it's like convention. It doesn't.
At the bottom where it says export default app, semicolon, why is it at the bottom? Because in the React tutorial with the tic-tac-toe, it said we do the export default app before like the main function of the whole thing. So like where it would say constant app, it would say export default. Does it make a difference?
Like up here?
No, like it'd be like before. So instead of like constant app equals and then the empty parameter, it would be like
Oh,
export app, and then yeah. Does that make a difference? I mean, it seemed like it was working before, anyways.
that works too. Doesn't really matter.
See the importance of it.
It's like another way to do it. Did you hear what I said about the to do add? When we execute this function, it'll remove. Oh, I didn't get to it. Yeah, the problem with doing it this way to add a to do is it'll remove all the other items in the to do list and just add this new state. Because basically we're resetting the entire state variable to just be an array with this single value, which is the input state, which is what we type in here.
Could you explain that a little bit simpler and slower one more time?
Yeah. So if we so this input state is equal to the text we type in here, right? It's a string.
Okay.
When this code executes, it's going to set to do items. And I guess, do you know how set to do items works?
So set to do items, based off what this looks like to me, is if you put the parentheses next to set to do item, then an input state, it would turn to do items into that input state.
Yeah, exactly. So then this, whatever I pass in here, becomes to do items. That's what you said, right? So to do
Yeah.
items will equal this. So what if I had a bunch of other, see, I have these to do items right here, hi world, but then I set the state to this array with input state. We basically got rid of these elements.
Yeah.
So that's a problem I'll show you how to fix in a second. But before we do that, let's just go with this. And I will say input value. So then we'll add the button next to the input. We'll say the button, and let's just call it add. Now this button called add. So then on click, we want to execute the add to do function. Okay, so now if I have this random text, I press add, it got rid of everything that was there and adds this to do item. Because this is how I explained how it would happen. Remember?
We'll do the perform add to do. So we click the add button, it will do, and what add to do is going to set to do items to input state. And input state is going to be whatever you type in there. So then whatever goes into input state, or whatever is to do items, is what is going to turn into a list item, which then will go to the input value input state. Okay, yeah.
Okay. So now we need to fix it so that way it doesn't erase all the existing to-do items and just add the new to-do item. It adds the to-do item to the end of the other to-do item. And you could, do you know what the spread operator is? I need to add that in the course. It's not in there. So the spread operator, let me just show you how that works. Let's say I have A, B, C. Okay. By console.log array, it's going to be this array right here, these elements. Does this log statement make sense to you? Can you read it?
I don't really understand where the 1, 2, and 3 came from.
So the 0, 1, and 2.
Or yeah,
so
0, 1, 2.
this is Chrome. This is a Chrome browser. And this is how, when we use the console, you know what? Let me show you my terminal. Okay, this is how I can execute JavaScript code. So if I console.log, let's say const array equals A, B, C. So array looks like that. So this array, right? Now, if I spread array, I don't think I can spread it. Wait, what? Oops, I forgot to put another dot. Okay. So if I do console.log, it's going to log this array. But if I do console.log dot array, it's called a spread operator because it basically it takes it takes the elements within this array and takes them out. Kind of like how, remember how I said, like when we put an array in the JSX, it unpacks it. So that's basically what the spread operator does. So now if I console out, and the dot is supposed to go before an array. So when I put it right before an array, it spreads it. So now it's just logging the string A, B, and C. So that's the exact same thing as if I did A, B, C. Because if I do, that makes sense? Okay. So when I set the to-do items, one way I could do it is I could spread the initial to-do items. And then after that, I can add the new to-do item, which is the input state. Now, this is a little more complicated because I'm spreading an array within another array, and then I'm adding another element after that. So does that make sense?
That does make sense, but why?
Because before we just had input state, and that was getting rid of all the existing items that were already in the to-do list.
Okay, this is the add to do function, which is on click, add to do. So when you click that button, it's going to do this, and this is the function. Okay.
So to not get rid of the other to-do items, we're going to keep it in there by existing to-do items within this array, and then we add the new element after. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if I do that, now it works. I can add it. Now, here's the thing with when you set the state. This is actually not how you want to do it. This can work, but this can create bugs because state updates are asynchronous. So like sometimes what can happen is if you update it like this, you might use the wrong version of to-do items. It might be like, it's okay. Let me just word it like this. In order to ensure that to-do items is the latest version of the state. Because right now, this actually isn't guaranteed that it's the latest version of the state. It could be like an older version.
Yeah.
So to guarantee it's the latest state, the function, which we named it as set to-do items, it can take just a regular variable to set the state to something new, but it can also take a function. And when you pass in a function, the way it works is that function will be passed in an input, which is the current state. And then whatever that function returns, it will set the new state. Now that I know current state is the latest state, and it's more safe to do it like this, I can press dot current state and then input state. So basically I'm going to return an array that
So
uses
it knows what current state means by default.
What was that?
It knows what current state means by default.
I can name this whatever. I can name it A. It's just a variable name. But if we look at the documentation, when we pass in a function, we know that this input is going to be equal to the latest version of the state.
Okay.
Let me see if I can find that updating state based on the previous state, because that's what we're doing. We're updating the state based on the previous state because we needed to equal the previous state plus the new item we're adding to it. So this React documentation says, suppose the age is 42. Let's see what we're doing here. Press me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Set. Updating set. Suppose the age is 42. The handler calls set age plus 1 3 times in here. However, after one click, age will only be 43 rather than 45. This is because calling the set function does not update the age state variable in the already running code. So each set age plus 1 call becomes set age 43. Basically what happens here is when we call this function set age, and so age is set to 42 already. When we do this, we're setting it to 43, but then when we do this again, age is still 42. It's not 43 yet. That makes sense? So to make sure that we're using the latest version, we pass in a function, and now it works properly where it updates 42, 43, 44. Okay, sorry, 43, 44, 45. So that's best practice. That's how we want to do it when we're updating the state based on the previous state. Okay, so now type here. Oops, what happened? Oh yeah, and I'm just calling it current state so it's descriptive so I can read the code. We can name it whatever we want. And I'm gonna get rid of this log statement. Okay, so we're making good progress here. So now we can add to-do items. So far, does all this code make sense? Or do you have any questions about
I
it?
think 2 questions.
Sure.
So anytime we want to edit something like in the box where it's with the e.target.value, anytime we want to do that, we're going to use that e.target.value.
So generally when you are creating like an input field and you want to be able to access that input field's state, the common convention is to do it like this. Yes, where on change, we use the event. On change, we pass in a function, which that function takes in the event as an input, and then we say e.target.value, which is going to equal the value of the input, and then we can do whatever we want with that value. And here we're setting it to a state. That is the common convention to update the state or update the value of an input element. I think it's called like controlled input or something. Concisely explain to me what a control versus what is in React. So React inputs can either be controlled or uncontrolled, and this distinction is about how form data is managed. It's not as concise as I would have liked it to be because I don't want to read the whole thing. In React controlled inputs, the input's value is managed by React state, and changes are handled via state updates. Yeah, basically, and see even in the example they gave us, they did e.target.value again. So this is a controlled input where, the input's value is managed by the React state variable and changes via the state updates, which is the set state. Uncontrolled inputs is when it's managed by the document object model, not React. We just use regular HTML handles it for us, where we can just type into it. And then I actually don't worry about this input ref. It's not relevant right now. But yes, this is the common convention to have your input elements to be controlled. Any other questions?
I'm a little confused again with the set to do items, current state, input state. So current state could be anything.
Current state? What do you mean by anything? It's always going to be what the current state is. So set to do items comes from here. So which comes from this use state hook. So these two variables are related to each other because when we set the state, it updates this. So for this set to do items, I'm calling it current state, like as if it's a generic name, but really what it is, it's the to do items because that comes from here. So this is always going to be the latest to do item state.
And so again, we're doing this function is what happens anytime you click on that button that says add. So then it's going to do set to do items and then basically take the newest of to do items and then the function is going to, it knows that this is going to be the newest version of the newest state of to do items because of the set to do items. So if you were to put set input state, then would the current state be the most current version of input state?
Sorry, say that again.
It says set to do items in the function. If you change that to set input state, then the current state would be the current state of input state.
Exactly.
Okay. So then we take now we're taking the most current state, and then we're spreading that out and then adding input state. Okay.
Makes sense? All this makes sense? Or got any questions? Because I want to make sure you understand it all before we move on.
It all makes sense.
Okay, cool. All right. So I think just the next thing is like when I add it, this text should go away. So what we can do is like in the add to do function, after we set the to do items, we can just set the input state to an empty string. So adding something. Oh, I remember why. Okay, now I remember why. Remember before we used the form element instead of the button on click? Instead of button, we use the form elements and then we use the input with the type of submit.
Oh yeah.
We did that. I actually forgot why we did that, but it's the reason we do that is because if I press enter right now, I'm pressing enter, it doesn't actually add it. That's because it only adds it when I click this button. Now using the input, putting these inputs inside the form element and making this button an input with the type submit, it makes it to where you automatically can just press enter and it'll execute the on submit function, which it would be the add to do. Now we don't have to do the form element though. We could just make it so that way, like we could add an event handler to input. I don't know exactly. I have to look it up, but it could be something like on key press. And so it'll wait for a key press, or maybe it's on enter. I don't know, but you could look it up. But basically it would be on some kind of event when someone presses enter in the input box, let's execute the function. So we could do that manually as well, but it's more simple just to rely on the existing HTML implementation, which does it for us. So on submit, we're going to pass in the add to do form. And then instead of this button, it's going to be an input and it's going to be a type of submit. So if I press enter now, it enters it. Oh, but you know what? It actually restarts the whole page. And that's because we need to also, so when we use okay, so before I move on, does that make sense? Because maybe not, I might have to explain more. Because basically
on submit it's a predefined, okay, so on submit equals add to do on submit, but we haven't defined on submit. So is that, it already knows what that means? Is that when you press enter, that's what happens, or?
Yes. Or if you click the input of type submit button, it'll execute the on submit, whatever function is passed into on submit.
Okay.
So that makes sense. Now, the way whoever made HTML and JavaScript, when you press enter and it submits the form, it'll reset the page. So it's to prevent that, what we would need to do is, we want to prevent the default on submit, which is when we execute this function. So if I type it here, wait a second. Oh, did I save it? Oh, I need to add E here so I can have access to it. Because when this function is executed here, it automatically passes this as an input. So I need to like call it something. So it's a variable that I can use. There we go. So now it doesn't reset. Notice how I can also add empty.
The code where you turn early.
Huh?
So
okay,
if string or if input value equals and an empty string, then return nothing.
Yeah. So if target.value equals an empty string, then we could just return and we don't do any of this. Actually, we still want to prevent the default because we don't want the page to reset. So what we want to do here, actually, what's best practice is we're just going to add input state there because we won't actually know which e.targeted value we're looking at.
Yeah.
And any other questions about what's here so far?
Where did the set input state with the empty string underneath set to do items current state?
This one? What about it?
What's that for again?
Oh.
Yeah, what is that for?
Because if we don't do it, let me remove that input. We don't need that. So we don't do it and we add something, it just stays there. It makes sense when we submit it, like goes away, right? That's like it's just like a user design, user experience. Like that's how like it's supposed to function. It looks a little cleaner, right? That's how it's supposed to happen. And then since we're using the form element, I can also just press enter and it's way easier to work with. So any other
So if you didn't have that, it would still just say. So if you didn't put this input state with the empty string and you press enter, it'll still just stay there.
Yeah.
Whatever you type. Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions about any of this code? Okay, cool. So now we can add to dos. Now we got that. So we got that first part. So you understand like how the state shows the data and how we can add to do items, which is good. So now let's add a delete button to delete a to do item. This is where things now it gets a little more complicated. So let's just add. So right here, to do this so it's like more readable and then we have more space to work with. So this does the same thing. So you understand how this function works, right? For each item, it's going to return this li element. So what I'm going to do, actually, we can keep it in there actually. So what we're going to do, we're going to add a button that's just that X button. So now they all have this button, but we want to make it when we click it, it deletes that to do item. So the way we can do that is we can create a, and I'm gonna actually move the add to do function above everything.
If I
We're
had
gonna
to
add
take
the
a guess, could you say button and then on click equals function and then define that function?
exactly. So yeah, exactly. So I'll do button on click, and then that's going to be equal to, we can just call the function delete to do. And so now I got to define that function. We'll say const delete to do equals, and we're going to define it. We're not doing anything yet. And just to make sure it works, I'll say console.log delete. I don't want to. So now if I click, it says delete. You see that? So now we know it's working. So I like to make sure things are connected before I start adding more. So now we know they're connected and it's working how we expect it to. So when this button's clicked, it executes this function. So now we're going to actually try and delete it. Now, the way we can delete it is when we execute the delete to do item, we can pass information to the delete function, information that allows us to identify what to do item to delete. So
Is
I
this
could
where
just
the math came in? Is this where the
math dot
math.rect came in?
no, I think that was for the IDs. Oh, that's for creating an ID. Yeah, that in the previous implementation. Yeah, but we don't need that right now to do it. Yeah, I mean that'll come in handy when we're creating to do items. But for now, let's start with this. So before we get into that, we can't just do delete to do item and just call it. Basically, what we want to do is when we call the delete to do item, we want to pass in the item, but we can't do this because this is just going to execute immediately. We want it to only execute on click. Because let's say from this delete to do item, I return like a string hello. Then basically all we're doing is we're setting on click to hello because we're just executing it immediately. Does that make sense? And we don't want to do that, but I just want to make sure that I get that.
So you're saying that if you were to do that, then on click, the button, what? Wait, what would happen?
Don't try and make any assumptions on why I'm asking you. Just focus on literally my question, which is, I just want you to understand that right now with the current definition of this function, it returns a string called hello. And so if I call hello here, if I execute, I don't need to pass anything into it. If I execute this function, it's just going to return whatever it returns here, which is just that string hello.
I wouldn't render anything on the screen, would it?
Nope, but we don't want to do that. So my point is we don't want to just execute it out of nowhere. We only want to execute it when it's clicked. So to do that, what we do is we can do an anonymous function. So we make it equal to a function. So that way, when this function is clicked, it executes delete to do, and it will, then we can execute it. So let me show you console.log delete. I just had it like this first, and I refresh the page. It's just going to say delete right away. And I click the X, it doesn't actually do anything, but because it executes right away. If I put it inside an anonymous function and I reset the page, it doesn't console.log delete because it's not executed until it's clicked. Now it's executing. So this would be the same as if, never mind. But
is that little parentheses at the end of delete to do, is that necessary right now with no parameters?
It's not necessary.
So it would still work if you didn't have that, right?
Yeah, we could just do it like this.
But that will do it right away, right? Without you having to click it or do anything to it as soon as the
oh no, this won't do it right away because I don't have the parentheses right now. I removed it.
Okay.
So now it's just the function. So then on click, it'll execute that function. But if I do the parentheses right here, it just executes it like when the code runs.
Oh, okay.
But the reason I'm going to do it like this is because I want to pass this delete to do item function this item so we can identify what item we're trying to delete. But like I said, if I do that, that just executes immediately, not when it's clicked. So I can just put it inside an anonymous function and then it only does it when it's clicked. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So now I can add that input here and I can say console.log item just to verify. I'm going to delete everything. Okay, so I'm going to click X. This is world. And now if I click hi, if I click the X on the hi, it shows hi. How far does this make sense? This button, and then how it's executing that, and how it's logging the item that we pass into it. And that when we click the X, it only console.logs that specific. Okay. All right. So now we can identify what we want to delete. So one way to do it, which you mentioned the math.random function and creating an ID, and that would be a better way to do it. But I'm going to do the most simple way first, is we can just look in our inputs, or sorry, in our to-do item state, and we can just look for a to-do item that is equal to this item that we're trying to delete. And if they equal, then we just remove it. So the way we can do that is we can set to-do items, and we want to access the most recent state. So we'll just call it current state, and we're going to return current state filter. And before I even get into it, I want to make sure you understand what's going on so far. This filter is basically going to somehow we're gonna add code in here to filter out the item we want to delete.
I'm following. So next, this is the part where it says if key is not equal to key would be
Yeah.
the rest of the filter.
Yeah. But the way we're doing it right now is we're just saying we can, let's call this item to delete. So that's the input that's being passed in. Do you under, right? And then this is just an item that we're checking. So basically I'm going to return true or false. I want to return true if I want to keep the element. I want to return false if I want to get rid of the element. So I'm going to return item. I want to check if it equals item to delete. And if it does equal item to delete, I want to return false. So if item does not equal item to delete, so if item does equal item to delete, this returns false. But if it doesn't equal item to delete, it returns true. So we keep it. So does this make sense?
That does make sense. But
Okay.
except for now how you've changed the parameter to item to delete,
Okay.
wouldn't you need to change the delete to do to, or so
Down
what
here.
is item to delete?
Item to delete is whatever input we pass into the function.
But don't they have to match?
Nope, they don't have to match.
So it's going to take item now, and
Yes.
that's going to item to delete. Okay.
And then it's going to be, yeah, it's going to take item. And then in here, it's going to be renamed to item to delete. Because do you know about hoisting and variable scope?
Variable scope, yes.
Okay. Yeah, variable. Basically, in this function, item is being declared and its scope is only in this definition. All these instances of item refer to this item. But when we pass it into this function, it's going to enter a different scope. And then we can rename item to whatever we want. So I'm calling it item to delete, which is going to equal to whatever we passed in here. But it doesn't need to be the same variable name because in a function, when we define the inputs, we can call it whenever we want. Remember you asked what was it? You asked current state. Remember you asked if I could do like if I could call it A or something, like something random?
Yeah.
I'm just calling it current state, but I can call it whatever I want. Because with functions, the inputs, do you know what I mean by inputs? The inputs is this, right? Yeah. So the inputs are just data. It's just data. It can be any kind of data. And then the job of a function definition is to handle that data and do something with it and then return a value. But when it takes in the inputs, which is the data, we can call that, we need to assign that data to a variable and we can call that variable name whatever we want. So here I'm just so whatever item is equal to, it's equal to some string. And here I'm just naming that string to item to delete.
I think we can continue moving on.
Okay, let's test if this works. I'm going to X high, it's gone. X world is gone. So does this make sense why this works now?
Yeah.
Okay, now there's a problem with this implementation because if I have like multiple elements with the same value and I delete one of them, I tried to delete one of them by clicking one of these buttons, it's going to delete all of them because in here, when it's checking if item equals item to delete, right now I just have them as simple strings.
Yeah.
And there's 4 that will equal the item to delete. When we delete one of these, it deletes all of them. So does that make sense why it does that? So now, yeah, you're mentioning with the math.random, this is when we want to assign a unique ID to each to-do item. So that way the to-do items have a unique ID, even if they're the same name. So that way we can use that unique ID to identify the one we want to delete. Does that make sense? Okay, so now I'm actually going to get rid of that. Or okay, actually, it's fine. I can do it here. So when we hard code it, in order to add an ID, I'm gonna make this into an object because now the whole to-do item, it's not just a string, it's the string and the ID. So I need to add different fields, and an object is a common way to hold multiple data points like that. So I'm going to call it, let's just call it name. So the string is not going to be equal to name, and then I'll have ID equal to some ID. So I have world equal to the world, and then ID equal to a different ID. Now, if I save that though, it's going to be a bug because it's no longer the structure we were working with. So when we create the list of to-do items, it should actually be item name, and then the key can be item.id. That would be perfect for a key. You want the IDs you want the keys to be like a unique thing for each item as well. Okay, so now we have the names from these objects. And now when we delete a to-do item, we just want to pass in the ID. So now we can call this ID to delete. And then when we go through the to-do items, we can return item.id does not equal item to delete. Let me know if you have any questions about any of that. Okay, so let's just make sure it still works. So I'm gonna delete hi world. Okay, it's not working because when I add a to-do item, I'm not updating it properly. So let's see when we add it. So when we add to do, we want to add input state. Wait a second. Yeah, we want to add input state. Yeah, so we're no longer just adding a string. We're going to add the object where the name is equal to that input string. And then we need to set the ID to something. So this is where we can just do a random number because we can't because here I could hard code it. I could hard code the ID numbers because it's just 2 and that's it. But here, this will happen every time we add a new to do item. And so we need it to be a unique number. So we can do math.random. I wonder.
Didn't you have to import the math.random thing?
Maybe. Sometimes they import it for you though. I don't know though, but now, yeah, sometimes they import it for you. I wonder what math.random returns. Returns a decimal. Math.random times 1 million or whatever. What is it? No, never mind. It's an integer. I'm trying to get rid of the decimal place. Okay, it doesn't really matter right now. So I guess it's just a decimal. So we're making the ID like a decimal, which is fine. And so we have a unique ID for each to-do item now when we add it. So now if I do, it only deletes the one that I click. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if I didn't do that, yeah, okay. Any questions about this so far? Are you ready to move on?
Okay, so can I see up there what we just did again? The math.random. So where is it? Okay, so set to do
random. Wait, where is it? Oh yeah, right there.
Name, input state, ID, math.random.
Okay, so I think we're almost done. We can add to-dos, we can delete to-dos. I think the only thing left is to now we need to be able to update. Okay, so remember I was talking about CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. That is, and since it's being recorded, I'll just repeat it. Those are the fundamental operations that you would expect a full stack application to be able to do. And if you can get CRUD down, if you know how to do create, read, update, and delete operations, then that kind of gives you the foundation to build any kind of app. Because ultimately, all apps are pretty much just creating, reading, updating, and deleting data in some way. The only difference is often there's a lot of logic and more complexities added or like how to update or to read. So instead of just reading data, you might want to check the user permissions if like a user has permission to read the data, for example. So there's more logic you can add to it. But like at the simplest level, before you start adding the complexities to it, it really comes down to just create, read, update, delete. So right now what we have is we're able to read the to-do items. We're able to read the data. We can create data by adding to-do items, and we can delete data by removing. Now we just need to update. So an existing entry, when we want to update it in some way, and we can do that by adding a check mark. And when the check mark's clicked, we make it crossed off. So now I'm going to add, and I'm gonna enclose this item.name in an element. Let's call it, it's just a span element is fine. So before the span element, I will add an input that is a type of checkbox. So now when I click it, it checks. But what we want to do is we want to make it so that way when we check it, this whole thing becomes a strike through. There's a cross. First, before I do that, and this is actually a common way to add functionality to a React app, is you start by just hard coding the data and making sure that the data is being displayed as you expect. And then once you make sure that's down, then you can add a function that updates the state data. And then you already know that if you update it to be something specific, it'll present the data in a way that you want because you verified that first. So what I can do here is if I refresh this page, I just have hi world. Let's say hello world, because it's like classic programming. Hello world. I can have another variable or another field in this object called completed, and it's a Boolean equal to true or false. I'll have the first one false, it's not completed, and I'll have the second one to true. So I just hard coded the data. And now what I want to make it do is so that way for the objects that have a completed field of true, we want to have it crossed out. So to do that, what we can do is we can come in here, we can look at our list. So whenever we render the list, we can style it and we can say, and actually I'm going to move that. It's not necessary. I guess it's good for style, but we don't need it. We want to add, okay, so I guess first before we even deal with that, this completed field, let's just try and make the strike through somehow. So without even have to work with a completed field. So what I can do is I can say style equals, I don't remember what it is. Font style, is it like, yeah, I don't know. I'll look it up. So that doesn't work because CSS make text strike through. Oh, and by the way, do you have this extension? You see how this just popped up for me? This is called grepper. Where is it? Oh yeah, grepper. So you can download it.
Oh, it's powered by ChatGPT.
Oh, I think that's a recent feature they added, but I have not used that feature. But yeah, you can download this extension so that way, like when I search stuff like this, the answer is right here. Okay, text decoration line through. That's how we add a strike through. Did you have any questions before I go on? So I'm going to add that here. And the thing to know about when we add CSS and as JavaScript and React, if there's like a dash, we actually get rid of that dash and we make the letter after that dash a capital letter.
Oh,
That's how we add CSS to, yeah, so that's how we do it. So basically that was just regular CSS. And then this is how I convert it to JavaScript CSS. And then this just needs to be a string, and I'm going to get rid of that. So now it's just so style is going to be equal to an object where the field is the CSS property and the value is the CSS value. So if I run this now, save, now you see they're all crossed out. Okay, cool. So now we know how to do that. So now the only thing to do left is to only do this if it's completed. So we can say, and we can separate the logic. I could do it in here inline. I could say the value is going to be item.id, or sorry, item.complete. Is it completed? Then make it line through. Else make it undefined. We're not going to make it anything. Make it null, undefined. So now it's only the second one. Sometimes it's more readable if I just say const is completed equals, oh, never mind. Actually, never mind. We don't need to separate it. This is fine. This is fine. Okay. So this makes sense to you? And usually undefined is often when a user like us, like when I'm coding and I'm trying to make like something and declare it as like a value that doesn't exist. Usually you want to use null because null will represent a user-defined non-existent value, whereas undefined is also non-existent value, but that helps. That's usually from JavaScript. So for example, if I try and access a field that doesn't exist in a object, it will return undefined. So usually when you see null, like a user made it null on purpose, but if it's undefined, it might be like on accident somehow from JavaScript. So I'm just going to follow that best practice and call this null. Okay, so far, does this make sense how by me adding the completed field to one of the to-do items, it makes it strike through, but not if it's false?
yes, yeah.
Okay, so now I did that first step, which is to add hard-code the data and then make sure that the data is being presented in the way that I expect it to. So now all I need to do is when I press this check, it changes that data for that to-do item. And then we know it's going to do what we want to show the cross or to show the strike through or not. So now,
I need to plug my laptop in. It's about to die.
okay, sure. So now I need to make it to where when I click one of these, it changes the completed field of that to-do item to be true or false. Does that make sense? Because that's like the last thing we want to do. And I think that was what the previous app did. So to do that, when we click, and this, I don't really remember how to do it. I think it's like on change. Yeah, on change. So let's create this new function called complete to do. And we're probably going to take an ID as well. So that way we can identify which, basically, yeah, let me do the logic first. So we take an ID and then basically we're just going to say, we're going to do something similar to delete to do. So I want to paste that in there. And so get the current state. And then instead of doing a filter, we're going to do a map. And then we're going to say if item.id equals, let's call this ID to complete. So if the current ID equals the ID to complete, then we want to return basically the current item. And remember I told you the spread operator and that how it spreads an array? We can also spread objects. So in here, I can spread what's already in item, which is now an object. And let me make sure you understand that. So if I have an object equal to, const object is going to equal to an object where we have A1, B2, C, unexpected number. I forgot to put the colon. So object is going to be this object. If I console.log object, it's going to console.log that object. If I console.log dot object, non-callable iterator. Okay, actually, if I wrap this, I do that. Okay, that's actually fine. So if I call, so basically this was the same output as this, because this I console.log an object, but here I console.logged an object too, but inside that object, I spread the object, which then gets unpacked and gets put into this object, but it's like the same thing because we're doing like, it's the same object being unpacked. And I can explain it more if you need me to. Do you understand how the spread operator works for an object or?
No.
Okay. So
what's the difference? I see no difference between the outcome of both.
Oh, no, there is no difference. The output's exactly the same, but I was trying to demonstrate. Yeah, it wasn't that helpful. Okay, let's try that again. So now console.log, this is going to log that object being spread, which if we remember, the original object is just ABC. So that's ABC 1, 2, 3. But then we put a comma after that, and then we added D4. So now when we console.log that whole thing, we have this new object that's A1, B2, C3, D4.
So is it that it's grouped them all together? So if it didn't have the brackets outside and the spreading, then it would return two different things?
I don't know. I didn't follow 100%, but if I don't do the spread operator, now what it is, that's confusing. Do you know how, what's it called? I forget the name. But if I pass in a value like that, basically it'll automatically make a key with that same name and it'll set the value to whatever that value is. You remember that? Did you learn that? It's not necessary right now. Let's not worry about that. I'm just gonna say other object to be equal to that. Oh no, that might not work. Okay, you know what? Never mind. Never mind. Let's just focus on what we had. Okay. Does this code make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so now you know how the spread operator works for an object.
Yeah.
It's similar to the array spread, right?
Yes. Okay, I see. So
Yeah.
it's not now when it's not returning an object, it's just returning all the things inside.
Yeah, but the spread operator for an array doesn't return an array either. Did you know that?
Yeah, that's what, but
It
yeah, this
it unpacks it.
takes everything out. Yeah. So it's
Yeah,
not they're all individual things that it's returning.
exactly. So does that make sense how now this is similar where we're unpacking this object into another object, and that's how we can add another key after it. So that way when we log it, it's like this. Okay, since you know that, now that's what we're doing here. We're going to say, so to update a to-do item, we're going to spread the item. And so that item will include the name, hello, the ID and the number, and also the completed and the Boolean. That's okay because whatever key value pairs come last, if that key already existed in the object, the last mention of that key replaces the first mention of the key. So to demonstrate that, if I console.log console.log an object where I say A1 and A2, it's only going to console.log A2 because this key value pair replaced this key value pair because it came last. So in here, when we spread item, it might already have the completed field within a Boolean, but then I'm just going to update it again, but I don't want to update it, or actually we'll do it for now. Because if I do true, this is a hard code true. And then, so that means I can only complete it, but I can't uncomplete it. And that's okay for now. We're just going to go with that. And then I'll show you how to fix that. So right now what we do, let me test it. I'm going to save that complete to do. And then where is it? On change, when this input, so when the checkbox is clicked, I believe the on change, and then we want to execute the complete to do and pass in the ID we want to complete. So I'll pass in item.id. So if I click check, okay, there's an issue. I think there's an issue with my complete to do function. I think I returned, like I made it to where the completed, like I messed it up. So like we can see, let's console.log what's going on here. Console.log do items, reset the page. Okay, so right now to do items, console.logs two objects that look like this, which is what I expect because that's what I hard coded as the initial state. If I try and check one of them though, I get all these errors, and that's probably because I look in this object, one of them becomes undefined. Let's see why that happens. Oh, I see why. That's because if item.id, so with this map function, if item.id equals ID to complete, we return that object with the completed field to be true. But then after that, we don't return anything. We just return undefined. So if I added like a bunch, so now we can see the objects. Here are all the values in that array. If I try and check one of them, all of them become undefined except the one I checked. And that's because for all the ones that the ID I was trying to update, for all of them, we just returned nothing from this function. So what we want to do is, if this doesn't execute, else we just return item. We just return it how it already was. Did that make sense at all?
Yeah. Yes, it did make sense. So return item.
Because this map function needs to return a new array with it, because this map function is supposed to return the modified version of each element in current state.
Okay, I see.
And so when we're updating it, we're mapping it to have the completed value to be true. But if we're not doing that, we still want to return it. We're just going to return it how it already was. But if we don't return it, it just gets returned as undefined. Refresh this, try it again, check. Now this is crossed off successfully. But if I uncheck it, it doesn't actually remove the strike. So we'll take care of that. And then also just to note here, we don't actually need to do this else statement because the return value will end the function. So the code after that won't execute, but you could also argue it's more readable to have it in an else block just to make it more clear. So that's fine. We can keep it like that. Okay. But now we can't uncheck it. So now we need to figure out how to uncheck it too. Because the problem is we're always just we're just updating it to true. We're updating it completed to true. So actually what we want to do is, we're not actually completing the to-do. I'm going to rename this to toggle to-do item completion. Maybe there's a better name. I don't know how they did it before. I forgot, but this is more what we're doing. We're toggling it. So yeah, I guess all we could do is we could just say completed equals not item.completed. So we just reverse the Boolean that it was already set to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So now, and I'm actually going to get rid of that. Okay, so now now it works, and I can do that, delete them, and that's pretty much the to-do app. So, because now we can update, this is updating the data. So we can add data, we can read the data, We can delete the data, update the data. So we can create, read, update, delete. So that's the to-do app. So do you have any other questions? Now we're finished. So do you have any other questions about the to-do app? So now you should try and code it yourself from scratch.
Yeah.
And then if you forget how to do one thing, look up the existing implementation of the to-do app. Hope you enjoyed the video, guys. If you want that kind of one-on-one coaching, links in the description. Book a call with me if you want. Otherwise, best of luck. I hope that video was helpful and take care.